"We don't have a position for a woman doing account work," the estate foreman said, and he filled the doorway the way men do when they've decided a doorway is theirs. "Turn around." Rosalind Kincaid set her travel bag down on the stone step, looked at Clifton Dre without blinking and said, "I have a hire letter with the Cavell Ridge Trust seal on it. Are you the trust?" He wasn't. She walked in. She had nothing. She had lost her position, her reputation in Halifax, and the particular kind of certainty that comes from believing institutions mean what they say. And she had already decided that no man standing in a doorway with his chest out was going to be the reason she turned back. If you've ever been pushed out of a job for telling the truth, you know the specific kind of anger that doesn't make you loud. It makes you very, very focused. This story is for you. Subscribe to Fated Love, follow this through to the end, and leave a comment telling me which province or city you're watching from. I want to know how far this one travels. The supply wagon had dropped Rosalind at a crossroads junction, 6 miles from the estate, with directions she had to read twice, and a September wind off the Rockies that wasn't interested in making her welcome. She had been traveling for 3 days, 2 on the CPR from Halifax to Calgary, 1 on a farmer's wagon east into the foothills, and she had spent most of those hours with her hand pressed against the letter in her coat pocket. The letter that had offered her a position as a state recorder for an operation called Cavell Ridge, managing land documents and supply accounts for a sheep and cattle property in the Alberta foothills. She had accepted without knowing who owned it. After what had happened at the Halifax land office, after the judge who had smiled at her while signing documents she had later proved were fraudulent, after the dismissal that followed her report, after the quiet closing of every courthouse door she'd tried to open in the city, Rosalind Kincaid had stopped trusting comfortable situations. Comfortable situations were how a person got buried. She picked up her bag and walked. The foothills were something she hadn't expected. Coming from the east, she'd imagined flatness, open prairie, but the land here moved, rolled and folded and rose until it became the true Rockies to the west, jagged and enormous and entirely indifferent. The light was different too, thinner, cleaner, with the particular quality of high country air that smells like pine resin and cold running water, and something else she couldn't name and suspected was simply distance from everything she'd known. She was nearly at the main gate when she heard it. An axe striking wood, steady and unhurried. Off the trail, where a section of stone fence had collapsed along the property line, a man was working alone. He had already cleared the fallen timber. He was now methodically resetting the stones, fitting them together with the patient attention of someone who understood that doing a thing properly the first time was the only economy that mattered. He didn't look up when she stopped. He was lean in the way of men shaped by actual work rather than the idea of it. His coat was worn at the elbows, his hat had been through at least 2 Alberta winters, and his hands, when she caught a glimpse, were calloused at the knuckle. He looked somewhere around 35, though the mountain light complicated ages. When he finally glanced up, his eyes were gray-green, the kind that shifted with the sky, and they moved across her once with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to reading situations rather than performing reactions. "You're looking for the estate," he said. It wasn't a question. "Cavell Ridge, yes." He tilted his head toward the main trail. "Gate's a 1/4 mile on Left Fork." "Thank you." He went back to the stone wall. She kept walking, and though she told herself not to, she looked back once. He was already working again, attention entirely on the task in front of him, as though she had never been there at all. The foreman, Clifton Dre, made his opinion clear within 60 seconds of her arrival. He was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with the manner of someone who had managed operations by making himself the loudest variable in the room. And he looked at Rosalind the way certain men looked at anything that arrived outside their planning, as a problem that hadn't asked permission. She had a letter. She had 7 years of experience as a court recorder in Halifax, and 3 more in a land registry office. She had, though she didn't say this to Dre, an extremely specific understanding of how falsified documents were structured, because she had spent 14 months building a case against a judge who had been authenticating fraudulent land transfers, a case that had been quietly buried, along with her career. Dre showed her the records room. The records room explained everything. Boxes stacked without logic, Ledgers from different years shelved together in no order she could identify. Supply invoices stuffed into a tobacco tin, and on the desk open to a column of wage entries. A ledger being used as a coaster for a coffee mug that had left a ring directly over the most recent figures. Rosalind picked up the ledger, set aside the mug, looked at the figures, and then looked again, because the number written in pencil in the margin beside the formal rate entry was different, smaller, and more recently added, by a hand that was not the same as the hand that had written the original contract terms. "When was this last properly organized?" she said. "Long enough," said Dre, which was not an answer. She worked until midnight on her first night by lamplight, and what she found in those first hours was enough to keep her sitting at the desk long after she should have stopped. The wage rates didn't match the signed agreements. Supply deliveries were recorded as received without corresponding invoices. Land payments were flowing to an account listed under a name she didn't recognize, Tate Land Holdings. Each discrepancy was small on its own. Together they formed a shape she recognized, not because she had studied fraud in theory, but because she had seen it done. She was still staring at the open ledger when she heard boots in the hallway. The man from the stone wall stood in the doorway, not leaning, not performing casualness, just stopped, in the specific way of a man who had made a decision to stop and was therefore stopped. "Late to still be working," he said. "The mess is larger than they described." He looked at the books spread across the table. His eyes moved across the open ledger page, with the kind of recognition that didn't come from passing curiosity. "When were these last in proper order?" she asked. "Before Dre took over the record side 3 years ago." "What changed 3 years ago?" He was quiet for a moment. "Things shifted," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at the ledger once more. "Don't work alone past midnight. Lock the room when you leave." Then he was gone, and the only sound was the lamp and the wind off the ridge. She locked the room. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. His name, she learned the next morning from a young ranch hand named Finn, was Rowan. He had a cabin up on the North Ridge, came and went without schedule. Nobody told him otherwise. "Why not?" Rosalind had asked. Finn had looked at his boots. "Don't rightly know," he said, "just nobody does." She found the land transfer document on her third day. It was filed with old grazing permits from 6 years prior, which was where someone had put it when they had needed it to disappear without actually vanishing. A legal instrument signed under the authority of the Cavell Ridge Operating Trust, dated 16 months ago, transferring 280 acres of North Meadowland to Tate Land Holdings for a listed consideration of $1. Rosalind read it 3 times. Her hands were very still on the page. She put the document in her coat pocket and went to find Rowan. He was at the paddock water trough, filling a bucket for the morning horses, the same unhurried economy of motion she was beginning to associate entirely with him. He set the bucket down when she stopped beside him. "Do you know the name Tate Land Holdings?" she said. Something in him went still, not the stillness of someone searching their memory, the stillness of a man who already knew exactly what she was referring to and was deciding, in real time, what to carry forward. "Where did you see it?" he asked. "On a land transfer document. 280 acres of North Meadow transferred 16 months ago for $1. She watched his face. "That land is worth considerably more than $1. "Yes," he said, "it is." "Do you know who authorized the transfer?" He picked up the bucket. "I know who signed it. I don't know who arranged it. Those aren't always the same person." "Rowan." She stepped closer. "If you know what's happening in those records, I need you to tell me. I was hired to manage the accounts for this estate. If someone is stealing from it—" "They are," he said quietly. She went very still. "They have been," he continued, "for at least 2 years, the wages, the supply accounts, the land transfers. It's all the same operation." "And you've known?" "Yes." "For how long?" He looked at her with a dark measuring quality she was beginning to understand was not coldness. It was the look of a man who carried a great deal and had learned to hold it without display. "Long enough," he said, and then Dre's voice cut across the yard and Rowan picked up his bucket and walked. That evening Rosalind heard 2 men talking behind the equipment shed, the kind of conversation pitched low and careful, meant not to carry. She stopped. She should have walked on. She didn't. The parcels Tate wants next. They border the CPR right-of-way on the eastern side. He wants them before the winter inspection. Once the snow locks the passes, nobody's checking survey stakes until April. A pause, and the woman, the one doing the records. Dre doesn't think she's a problem. Dre doesn't think. Silence. Move the original wage books from 1889 before she gets to that section. Those numbers are what would actually matter in a courtroom. Rosalind pressed her back against the shed wall and breathed. She already had those wage books. She had already copied the most significant entries. But now she understood something that changed the shape of everything. They knew she was there, and they were moving their timeline because of her. She was already a threat. She had no time left to be careful. She found Rowan at his cabin on the North Ridge that night, a light burning in the window, door standing open against the cold. She knocked on the frame anyway. He looked up from the table where he was working a length of tack. The cabin was exactly what he was, entirely functional, containing only what was needed: a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed. A shelf of books that surprised her more than she expected: land law, surveying, territorial history, a Bible that looked genuinely read. She sat down across from him. "Tell me who you actually are," she said. He set down the tack. For a moment the only sound was the fire. Then he reached behind the row of books and produced a folded document. He placed it on the table in front of her. It was a letter from the Northwest Territories Land Registry, Calgary office, addressed to Rowan Ashby Cavell, Cavell Ridge Estate, Alberta Territory. Rosalind read the name twice, then she looked up. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes, and she now understood that what she had read as stillness was something else entirely. The particular patience of a man who has been waiting with considerable discipline for exactly this moment. "Cavell," she said. "Yes." "This is your estate." "Yes." She looked at the simple room, the worn coat on the peg, the boots with the cracked left sole, the 2 chairs, one of which had never been used before tonight. "You own this entire operation," she said. "I do, the same way my father did, by working it." The silence between them was taut and complicated. "Why?" she finally said. He sat back. "I was in Calgary for 3 years managing the business side of the holdings. When I came back, I found that the people Tate put in place were treating the men on this payroll like figures in a column. Wages cut, conditions declined, workers afraid to speak because Tate controlled the contracts." He looked at the stove. "I could have dismissed everyone and started over, but I'd seen what happened when a man announced his power before he understood the situation. You give the bad actors time to hide. So you hid yourself instead." "I worked," he said. "I watched. I learned what was happening and who was doing what to whom. And then I arranged for someone with proper document skills to be brought in through the trust." The air left the room. Rosalind sat very still. "You hired me," she said. "I arranged for the trust to extend the offer. You knew who I was. I knew you had spent 3 years as a court recorder in Halifax. I knew you had spent another year building a case against a judge authenticating fraudulent land transfers. I knew that case was buried and that you lost your position because of it." He met her eyes. "I needed someone who would recognize what was in those records, not as an abstraction, but as something she had already lived through the consequences of." Rosalind felt something sharp and complex move through her chest. "You recruited me," she said, "without telling me what I was being recruited for." "Yes." "You don't get to make that choice for me." "You're right," he said. "I'm telling you now." She stood. She crossed to the window and looked out at the dark, where the foothills rolled away under a sky so dense with stars, it seemed impossible they were the same ones she'd known in Halifax. She thought about the judge, about the 14 months she had spent building something careful and true, and watching it disappear in a single afternoon. She turned back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something in him shifted, not relief exactly, but the posture of a man who has been carrying something at considerable cost and has finally been permitted to set it down. "Everything in those records," he said, "documented, cross-referenced, irrefutable. How long do we have?" "Tate visits quarterly, next visit in 3 weeks." She thought about the boxes, the scope of what she'd already found. "I need access to everything. including whatever you haven't shown me yet. You'll have it. And I need you to understand something. She looked at him directly. I am not doing this for you. I am not doing this for this estate. I am doing this because the men on this payroll are being robbed, and nobody fought for the people who were robbed in Halifax, and I am not willing to watch that happen again. He held her gaze. I know, he said quietly, that's why I asked you. She picked up her coat. First light, she said. We start. She worked for the next week with the particular focus of someone who has been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of task. She arrived before dawn. She catalogued, indexed, cross-referenced. She kept everything she flagged in a locked case she had brought herself, the only container in that room she fully controlled, and she watched. What she found in those 7 days was not chaos. It was a system disguised as chaos. Wage rates in the formal ledger that didn't match the rates used for actual payment. Supply deliveries recorded as received with no corresponding invoices, the difference flowing through a holding account into Tate Land Holdings. Land transfer documents, 6 of them across 16 months, each parcel transferred for $1. And then, on the 8th evening, she found the shape beneath the transfers. She sketched a rough map from the boundary descriptions in the documents. When she placed it beside the CPR survey map she had found in the original land registration files, the picture came clear all at once, the way things do when you've been looking at every piece and finally see what connects them. The 6 parcels Tate had transferred were not random. Each one had documented water access. Each one was adjacent to the one before it. Together they formed a continuous strip running from the eastern boundary of the Cavell Ridge property to a boundary shared with the Canadian Pacific Railway right-of-way. Tate wasn't stealing grazing land, he was building a corridor. Land adjacent to a CPR right-of-way in 1891 was worth 10 times its agricultural value. It could be sold to the railway for expansion, leased for depot sites, used as the foundation for a supply town. In the Alberta Territory, that was the foundation of a fortune. And Cavell Ridge's eastern meadow parcels were the keystone. Without them, the corridor had a gap. With them, it was complete. She went to find Rowan. He was at his cabin, still dressed, the stove burning low. The transfers aren't about the grazing value, she said. He stepped back to let her in know. You knew about the CPR corridor. I suspected it. I didn't have the documented sequence until... He looked at the papers in her hand. Until now. She spread the map on the table. He needs 2 more parcels, the eastern meadows. That's why he wants them before the winter survey. She looked up. Rowan, if those parcels go through, the corridor is complete. He can sell to CPR, dissolve the management arrangement, and disappear behind his legal structure. Every man on this property loses his position. Every family who trusted the contracts loses their housing. The fire had burned low, and neither of them moved to tend it. How long do we have? She asked. 12 days. I received a telegraph from Calgary this afternoon. He moved his visit up. 12 days. Rosalind felt the pressure settle, not as panic, but as clarity, the specific kind that arrives when a deadline stops being abstract. Then we work faster. She paused. To file a formal contestation with the Territorial Land Office, we need the ownership documentation, the full fraud record, sworn statements from affected workers, and a qualified representative to file in Calgary. I know a barrister there, honest. He'll file if we bring him the documentation. If we file before Tate arrives, he walks into a situation where the transfers are frozen and the evidence is already in the court's hands. Rowan's jaw set. He can't make documents disappear if they're already filed. She looked at the map for a long moment. There's one more thing, the first transfer document, the one that started the sequence, the signature authorizing it. Whose is it? He was quiet for one beat too long. Rowan. Someone who was convinced by Tate that it was a standard financial restructuring, he said carefully. Someone who trusted the paperwork he was given and didn't understand what he was actually signing. Rosalind looked at him. Was it you? His expression was the answer. She closed her eyes briefly, not from defeat, but from the precise weight of understanding what that meant for everything she was building. He has your signature on the originating document, she said. He can claim you authorized the beginning of the entire scheme. Yes, that's his insurance. If anyone comes after him, he shifts the liability. How long have you known this? Since I understood the full scope of what he was doing, That's why the rest of the documentation has to be absolutely irrefutable. Your analysis isn't enough alone, and my word isn't either. It has to be in the records themselves. Rosalind stood at the window. The mountains were shapes in the dark, enormous and unmoved. "There's an argument," she said slowly. "If the court can see that every transfer after the first was executed without your knowledge or signature, that the first document was used to establish false authority for everything that followed, then the pattern itself becomes the proof. A legitimate restructuring would have required ongoing documentation. The fraud required him to never come back to you. That absence is not a gap in the evidence. It is the evidence." He looked at her. "That's the argument." "That's the argument I have to build," she said, "in 12 days. She built it. She took sworn statements from every long-term worker on the property. 43 men. Finn organized it. Went to the bunkhouse 2 nights in a row and spoke to the men one at a time, and what he collected and brought to her desk was the thing she had hoped for and hadn't fully counted on. The specific, careful testimony of people who had been carrying an injustice in silence for a long time and were now, finally, handing it to someone who knew what to do with it. When Dre sent a telegraph to Calgary 2 days later, Rosalind understood the timeline had collapsed further. He'd seen too much. He knew she was building something. She and Rowan rode out before dawn, the document case strapped across her saddle, the most critical evidence copied and pressed flat against her ribs beneath her coat. They were 2 hours from Calgary when the hoofbeats behind them resolved from road noise into something deliberate. 2 riders, moving with purpose. Rowan shifted his horse without a word, placing himself between her and the sound, the automatic response of a man assessing a threat before he'd put a name to it. "Tate's people," she said. "He has contacts throughout the territory. If Dre telegraphed last night, they had time to arrange this. There's a freight station ahead, public space, other travelers. They won't act openly with witnesses." His voice was entirely steady. She matched her pace to his, kept her hand on the document case, and reached inside without slowing to withdraw the copy of the most critical wage entries. She pressed it flat against her coat inside the lining. Then she rode. The freight station came up ahead. Wagons, horses at the rail, several men moving through the yard. Rowan pulled up and was dismounting before his horse fully stopped. Rosalind was already down. They walked inside at a normal pace, not running, not frightened. Behind them, the 2 riders slowed and did not follow. They pushed through to Calgary without stopping. Rosalind did not allow herself to think about what happened if this failed. That was a door she was not willing to open. The Northwest Territories Land Registry Office was a stone building on Center Street. Solid and deliberate in the way of institutions that want to communicate permanence to places still deciding if they believe in it. A clerk was locking the front door when they arrived. "Office is closed," he said. "Come back tomorrow at 8. Tomorrow might not exist in the form they needed. Behind them, somewhere in Calgary, 2 men who had followed them through the night were stabling their horses and sending a message to whoever had sent them. Rosalind turned to the clerk. "I need to speak with the land registrar tonight," she said. "Tell him the operating documents for the Cavell Ridge Estate Trust are in my possession. Tell him there is evidence of systematic land fraud involving CPR corridor acquisitions across at least 4 Alberta properties. Tell him the man who arranged the fraud arrives in the territory in 11 days. She held the clerk's gaze with everything she had. "And tell him that if he looks at these documents tonight, he will have the opportunity to stop the largest land fraud case this territory has seen. If he waits until tomorrow morning, some of that evidence may have developed complications." The clerk stared at her. He looked at Rowan, who said nothing, who simply stood there with the patient, immovable quality she had come to understand was the most powerful thing about him. A man who had already accounted for the obstacles and decided they were manageable. The clerk went back inside. 7 minutes passed. The door opened. "Judge Pollock will see you," the clerk said. She walked inside, and behind her, somewhere in Calgary, Monroe Tate's hired men were finding a telegraph office, and in the Alberta foothills, 43 workers were waiting with the particular patience of people who had waited a long time already and had decided, for the first time, that waiting might actually lead somewhere. Judge Pollock was 60 years old. careful and deliberate in the way of men who had spent decades distinguishing between things that were believed to be true and things that actually were. He looked at the first document Rosalind placed before him and read it without speaking for a long time. Then he looked up. "Sit down," he said. She sat. Rowan took the chair against the wall, not inserting himself into the presentation, just present, holding the space around it. She walked Pollock through the document sequence exactly as she had structured it. The wage fraud first. She placed the original contracts beside the secondary ledger side by side and let him see the divergence without narrating it. A judge of 30 years didn't need narration. He needed evidence organized clearly enough that his own intelligence could move through it freely. He asked 4 questions. She answered all 4 without hesitation, with specific page references, because she had anticipated every one of them during the overnight ride and had the supporting documents tabbed accordingly. When she placed the corridor map beside the 6 transfer documents in chronological order, Pollock stopped reading. He looked at the map for a long time. "This is a deliberate land assembly," he said, "not a question. Executed over 16 months through 6 fraudulent transfers, each targeting parcels with documented water access and CPR adjacency. The complete corridor, when the final 2 parcels transfer, connects the eastern boundary of Cavell Ridge directly to the railway right-of-way. Current land value to CPR for expansion, conservatively between $30,000 and $50,000. Pollock set down the map. The controlled anger of a man who believed in the law and was looking at evidence that someone had treated it as an obstacle rather than a foundation. He read the worker statement slowly, all 43. When he finished the last one, he was quiet for a moment. "And this document," he said, looking at the bottom of the case. "You saved it for last." Yes, she placed it, the first land transfer, Rowan's signature. Pollock read it completely. Then he looked past Rosalind at Rowan. "Mr. Cavell." "This is my property," Rowan said. "I signed that document under the representation by my managing agent that it was a routine administrative restructuring. He had standing authorization to execute routine filings on behalf of the trust. He used that authorization to mischaracterize a fraudulent land conveyance as a routine matter. And every subsequent transfer was executed without your signature. Without my knowledge or signature. Because the fraudulent first transfer had been used to establish a precedent of owner cooperation that he cited to the notary for every document that followed. A genuine restructuring would have required ongoing documentation. The fraud required him to never come back to me." Pollock looked between them. "You assembled this together?" "Yes," Rosalind said. He looked at her steadily. "You have a personal connection to this type of fraud." "My career in Halifax was ended because I reported it. That experience does not bias my analysis. It qualifies it. I know exactly what this pattern looks like because I have already seen what it costs." Pollock held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the entire document set and squared it neatly against the desk. "I'm going to need 2 hours," he said. "There's a hotel on Stephen Avenue. Come back at 8. I'll have my clerks send for the NWMP detachment sergeant." Rosalind stood. "Judge Pollock, we were followed from the estate. 2 men. They know we're in Calgary." "Are you asking me to move quickly?" "I'm asking you to understand that the situation has a timeline not entirely under our control." He nodded once. 8 o'clock. The hotel supper was the first full meal either of them had eaten in nearly 40 hours, and Rosalind consumed hers with the focused efficiency of someone refueling rather than dining. Rowan ate with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, though his attention moved across the room periodically in the quiet way of a man who had assessed a threat and not stopped tracking it. When Finn arrived at 7:30, road-worn in the way of someone who had ridden very hard for very long and knew the news he carried would change the shape of things, Rosalind understood before he opened his mouth that the calculation had shifted again. Dre had tried to reach the records room the previous evening, Finn said. Found 8 of them already inside. Dre had turned around, taken a horse from the stable, and ridden west. And he'd left something behind in the office waste bin. A letter on Tate Land Holdings letterhead, dated 5 months prior, addressed to Dre, authorizing him, if a thorough records review was initiated by any party, to destroy the secondary wage ledger and the original 1888 land survey documents. Written 5 months ago. before Rosalind had ever been hired, before any review had begun. Tate had known the fraud would be discoverable if properly examined, and he had arranged a destruction order before any threat had materialized. Rosalind read the letter once. She set it down. "The secondary wage ledger," she said. "The large brown-covered book, second shelf from the left. Do you have it?" Finn reached inside his coat and produced it. She opened it to the page she had memorized and confirmed that the ink was original, the notary stamp genuine, the paper the same aged stock as the surrounding entries. Physical evidence that no lawyer could argue was a copy. She looked up at Finn, at the 7 men standing behind him in the hotel doorway, still in their travel coats, still carrying the specific tiredness of people who had done something that cost real effort and knew it had been worth it. "You rode through the night," she said. "Didn't seem optional," Finn said. At 8 o'clock, Rosalind placed the Tate to Dre letter on Pollock's desk. He read it standing up. He read it twice. Then he said to his clerk, without looking away from the page, "Get Sergeant Auld now." The clerk left at something that was essentially running politely. "Premeditated obstruction," Pollock said. "Written 5 months before I was hired, before any review had been initiated. He knew the fraud was discoverable and arranged a contingency before any threat existed. That's not civil fraud. That's criminal conspiracy to obstruct a territorial court investigation." Pollock set the letter down. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man organizing his understanding of something with considerable scope. "I'm issuing an emergency injunction tonight," he said, "freezing all Tate Land Holdings transactions involving Alberta properties pending investigation. The Cavell Ridge parcels and every associated transfer are frozen as of this moment." He looked at Rowan. "Mr. Cavell, the estate is your property and the injunction restores your uncontested ownership authority. You can authorize the NWMP's access." "I authorize it." And Tate himself. "A criminal conspiracy charge requires a warrant. I'll have it drafted tonight. If he enters the territory, the NWMP detachment will be waiting." They were on the steps of the land registry at 9:15 when the hoofbeats came up the street. Not 2 riders this time, but several, organized and purposeful. The sound of people who had ridden hard and arrived at a destination. Finn pulled up at the base of the steps with 7 men behind him. Rosalind came down and took the ledger from him and opened it and confirmed it was real. Original ink, original paper, the physical document that no lawyer in the territory could argue was a secondary copy. She looked up at Finn. His face held the particular brightness of a young man who had made the right decision and could feel it settling into certainty. "Dre," she said. "Tried for the records room 2 hours after dark. Found 8 of us already inside. He left. Took a horse west." Finn paused. "Figured that was the NWMP's business, not ours." "It is," she said. "The sergeant is already on his way to the estate." Finn looked past her at Rowan, the look of a young man adjusting his picture of a person, deciding, in real time, whether the adjustment makes them larger or smaller in his estimation. From his expression, the answer was larger. "You ate with us every night," Finn said. "Yes." "And you knew the whole time." "I knew, and I was building a case that would stick." Finn was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said, the word carrying everything he wasn't saying. Monroe Tate's private coach was intercepted at the territorial boundary 3 days later by an NWMP detachment acting on the warrant Pollock had signed. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with the groomed certainty of someone accustomed to having his authority respected. And he looked at the documents the constable handed him with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he had planned for, and finding it had arrived from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He looked at Rosalind, who was present for the formal injunction service. He looked the way she had not quite expected, ordinary, well-tailored, the kind of man you would trust across a desk in a well-appointed office. She supposed that was the point. She supposed that had always been the point. The evidentiary hearing before Judge Pollock took place 41 days later in a Calgary courtroom that was not large but was full. Tate's lawyers were skilled and challenged everything: the authenticity of the copied records, the collective standing of the workers, Rosalind's personal history as evidence of disqualifying bias. Pollock overruled every challenge. On the bias argument, he said for the record, The court finds that the witness's direct experience with the mechanism of fraudulent land transfers constitutes relevant expertise, not disqualifying bias. The court further notes that the documents submitted speak independently of the witness's interpretation, and those documents have not been successfully challenged on their merits. Tate's lead counsel tried once more. Your Honor, the respondent's case rests on the assertion that subsequent transfers were unauthorized. The original document bearing the estate owner's signature has been thoroughly addressed, Pollock said. The pattern of subsequent transfers, 7 additional conveyances executed without the owner's knowledge or signature, constitutes evidence that the original authorization was obtained through misrepresentation. The court has reviewed the full sequence. The argument does not hold. He looked over his glasses. Is there a substantive point you'd like to make, or shall we proceed to findings? Tate's lawyer sat down. Rosalind, at the respondent's table, let out a breath she had been holding for 41 days. Pollock read his findings for 33 minutes. The land transfers were declared fraudulent and void. The 6 Cavell Ridge parcels were restored to the estate trust. The wage fraud against 43 workers was confirmed with an order for full restitution plus interest. The Tate Land Holdings operation across all affected Alberta properties was placed under receivership. Monroe Tate was bound over for criminal trial. When Pollock finished, the courtroom was quiet for one moment. Then someone in the gallery began to applaud, not dramatically, just the sound of people who had been carrying something for a long time and had finally been permitted to set it down. Outside, in the cold November air, a rancher named Connell found Rosalind at the bottom of the courthouse steps. He was a large, weathered man in his 60s, one of the families from the foothills whose parcels had been caught in Tate's corridor scheme. He took off his hat. "Miss Kincaid," he said. His voice had the particular difficulty of a man delivering a message that means more than he has words for. "My wife asked me to find you. She wanted me to tell you." He stopped. Tried again. "She wanted you to know that she didn't sleep last night, lying awake thinking about what would have happened if nobody had come." Rosalind looked at him. "Tell her she's welcome," she said, "and tell her the next time anyone shows up with documents that need signing, read every line, everyone." He almost smiled. He put his hat back on and walked away. Rowan came to stand beside her. "He's right," he said. "That was the difference. Not the documents, not the law. The documents and the law were already there to be used. The difference was a woman who showed up and decided to use them." She looked at the street. At Finn, explaining something to the ranch hands with his characteristic earnest energy. At the Connell family climbing into their wagon, the wife turning to look back at the courthouse, with an expression that was going to take a long time to describe and would probably need language that didn't exist in legal documents. "My father would have liked to see this," she said. It was the first time she had spoken of him in a way that didn't compress her chest. She said it simply, without the weight she usually carried it with. It was, she thought, the first time she'd been able to. Rowan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply stood beside her in the cold November air with the patient, solid presence she had stopped trying to analyze and had started simply accepting as the specific quality of who he was. After a while he said, "Stay." One word, nothing decorative, just the word itself, carrying everything it meant. She looked at the Rockies visible at the end of the street, hard-edged and enormous in the November sky. She had arrived at Cavell Ridge with a travel bag and a refusal to be turned away, and the particular toughness of a woman who had already lost the thing she thought defined her and had kept going anyway. "You recruited me without telling me why," she said. "Yes, that was wrong. You let me believe things about your situation that weren't fully true." "Yes, that was also wrong." His voice was steady. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm telling you that from this point forward I intend to tell you the full truth of everything, because I've found out the hard way that the only thing worth that level of protection is the person in front of me, not the plan." She was quiet for a moment. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "Not because I don't have an answer, because I want to know what this is when there's nothing urgent holding us in the same direction. I want to know who you are when it's ordinary." Something moved in his expression, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen from him, which on his face was quiet and real, and considerably more affecting than a more performed version would have been. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. But the spring came sooner than she'd named it. It came on a February afternoon when she looked up from the records room, properly organized now, indexed and labeled, holding only what was real, and realized she had been at Cavell Ridge for 5 months, that she had testified twice without hesitation, that she had drafted the estate's formal submission to the receivership proceedings, and watched Pollock accept it without question, that she had eaten supper across from Rowan every evening for 5 months and knew, with the specific knowledge that comes from observation over time, rather than declaration, exactly who he was when nothing urgent was present. He was the same person in February as he had been in September. She found him at the stone fence on the north boundary, which had shifted again under the winter frost and was being reset with the same methodical patience she had seen on her very first afternoon at Cavell Ridge. He saw her coming and set down the stone. "I said, ask me in the spring," she said. He waited. "It's February. I'm not waiting for spring." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that she had stopped trying to read and had simply started trusting. "Stay," he said. "I was always going to," she said. "I just needed to know it was true when nothing was holding it in place." Monroe Tate's criminal conviction came down the following April. Substantial sentence. The corridor he had been assembling was dissolved, its pieces returned to the families he had taken them from. The workers received full restitution plus interest. It was not a perfect outcome. Perfect outcomes existed only in stories that valued tidiness over truth. There were men who had worked years at wages no court order could fully repay. There was a woman whose name still appeared on record she had tried to correct, in a city where certain doors would never open for her again. The law returned what it could. The rest of it you carried forward and used. On the first warm evening of April, Rosalind stood on the ridge above the estate where the foothills opened, and the whole of Cavell Ridge spread below in the last light of an ordinary day, a day that had contained nothing exceptional, and was therefore exactly what a life is made of. Rowan stood beside her. He didn't make a speech. He didn't have to. He took her hand. She let him. They stood there in the particular quiet of people who have built something together and know it, not through declaration, but through the accumulated weight of days spent choosing, again and again, honesty over convenience and the harder road over the easier one. The woman who had arrived with a travel bag and a refusal to be turned away had found what she had stopped expecting. Not the job, not the justice, though she had received both. She had found proof that a person who chose truth when it cost something would eventually arrive somewhere that had been waiting for exactly her. And the quiet man who had owned the mountain and chosen to live as a man who owned only what he needed had finally found what no amount of land could contain. Someone who had known him when he offered nothing but himself, and had decided, without hesitation, to stay. That was the whole of it.